I've worked in leverage finance or acquisition finance.
Do you see yourself sort of in corporate for the next 20
I
years?
think for me, there will always be a part of me that kind of wants to create something of my own. Corporate is something I can always sort of go back to.
Was that the route you took, the sort of traditional Asian sort of Sydney route?
I think that was the traditional Asian Sydney route I took. So I was quite focused academically, getting like tutoring for like HSC, and my parents were like pretty relaxed, and I was like, no, I want tutoring.
With your skill set, could you easily get a more chiller corporate job and have the exact same pay?
It probably is. I could probably go to like a government and get paid the same amount and have way less hours, but the future potential within that job is not as high as working in like a bank or like a corporate.
The like top four accounting firm. By 35, where would you be at within that company and how much would you be getting paid?
Could probably become a partner at that point. I'd say you could probably get up 400 to 500K per year.
Uh,
Hi, Andy.
how are you? How's your week been? How's 2025?
Yeah, it's been pretty good so far. Yeah, I feel like going into the back of last year was like so busy. Yeah, it's been really busy, and then like over the break, I feel like it was quite busy, sort of catching up with friends, people trying to create content. And now that I'm back at work, I feel like I need a holiday from my holiday. If you can relate to that.
How long did you get time off from work?
It was a good 2 weeks, um, but I think yeah, it was just a lot of sort of social events sort of piled on top of each other, which is good because I guess you get to catch up with people that you haven't caught up in a while. But yeah, I feel like I just need to like I don't know, spend a few days to just do nothing. I feel.
Yeah, I can relate. I recently realized that since I sort of have my own business, I sort of just work all the time, sort of ish, and then my days off are days where I have things scheduled in with friends, whether it's
Yeah.
on a weekend. But then I need to realize that like that really isn't like recharging. That really isn't like taking time off because you're like now spending time with friends. So even if you sort of work 5 days a week and have 2 days off because you have things scheduled in with friends, whether it's like a day trip or like a dinner, that's not actual rest time.
Yeah, yeah. You just sort of need that time to yourself, I think, to just like recharge and like do the things that you want to do. I think. And I totally get it with that. You owning your own business, like you don't really switch off, or it's harder to switch off because there's always more you can do, and that's your direct benefit from that is the work you sort of put in. Whereas when you sort of have like a corporate sort of 9 to 5, like it sort of ends when the day ends, and like the more effort you put in doesn't necessarily equate to more of like a reward or like return benefit in that sense. So like yeah, I can completely relate to that aspect as well.
Given that you have that sort of set schedule, do you always have your weekend sort of, does it feel like you get an actual recharge at the end of each weekend? You have the Saturday, Sunday, you catch up with friends, you have time on yourself, and then once Monday hits, you're sort of ready to go again. Does it feel like that or not really?
No, not really. I think like yeah, like having like is what my job is quite sort of demanding, like working in finance, especially like in the area that I work in, and like the period last year as well where it tends to get quite busy before Christmas. Like that the hours can sort of get quite long, especially on the weekdays, and I worked like most weekends in the last like month or two last year. So there's that aspect, but then also I think the main thing is like also having sort of content creation on the side and feeling the need to sort of obviously post consistently to consistently engage your audience. I think that definitely takes up a lot of that sort of remaining time that I have like after work and on the weekends, and something that I guess I'm always thinking about. And I think, yeah, like going into this year, like one of my sort of goals or like is to sort of know how to balance that time better between work and content creation and then for myself as well. Because I think part of like being able to do like your job and your sort of side hustle well is sort of also kind of taking care of yourself and having your own time, which helps you sort of to perform better in these other aspects and managing that sort of split like better. Yeah, it definitely is a struggle, I'd say. But I think something that you sort of, I think, especially for all, like if you sort of own your own business, I think probably the first challenge is sort of having your own boundaries around like how you spend your time. because no one else is sort of watching over your shoulder. You sort of have your own sort of input, and your own holding yourself accountable is quite difficult, especially if you're so used to having like a job or even just going to school where everything's sort of structured and your schedule is sort of defined by that sort of institution. It's having that own sort of discipline to sort of do things yourself and holding yourself accountable. I think that's probably like something that I'm trying to sort of get better at. Creating content on the side.
That's so cool. What type of finance are you in, Linda?
Yeah, so for the majority of my career, I've worked in this financing style called leverage finance or acquisition finance. So I think like the best way to describe that is there's like certain firms or organizations called private equity, and what they do is like take like a really easy example. So when you like buy a house and then you renovate it and then you sort of flip it 5 years later to sell at like a much higher price because you've done a lot of renovations to it, which would be like higher than what the average sort of market growth on that house would be. So that's what private equity companies do with private equity firms do with companies. So they would like buy a company which they think is a bit sort of undervalued because they might be going through some issues operationally, and then they might sort of fix a few things. Add in a few might add in a new management team, sort of increase the performance of the business. And then once they're able to sort of increase the performance of the business, they would sell it like 5 years later for a much higher price, and they would sort of get that sort of return in between. So that's what private equity does. And I guess my style of finance is essentially giving them the debt to acquire that business, which is similar to like giving the mortgage for someone to buy the house. So that was sort of, I guess, the majority of what I was sort of been working on. I've been on for like the majority of my career in finance, but recently I'm seconding in a new team, which essentially sort of like funds like transactions within the infrastructure renewables sort of space. So like when someone wants to build a solar farm, like we provide the financing for that. Or when someone wants to build like an airport or like a WestConnex tunnel, that's sort of where we come in to provide the financing. It's been a bit of a change in terms of my like career and operating sort of rhythm recently as well. But yeah, it's all been quite interesting and quite challenging.
Were you working in a financing company that would help private equity companies get financing, or were you like in-house within that private equity company? And
Oh, yeah, good question. I'm in a bank. So private equity can go to multiple types of institutions. Like mostly it's like a bank that they would go to, but there's also like other funds, private debt funds that they would go to as well. But yeah, I work at a bank.
In the current economy in Australia are flooded with cash and they're still looking for ways and investment opportunities to spend the money, or are banks are not flooded with cash and they're quite conservative and they're more than happy to just like hold it?
What do you mean by flooded with cash?
As I was reading in the book, when the government would do quantitative easing, all I guess, the few selected banks, they would, I think, the government will buy bonds from them, give them money in return, and now they have all this cash sitting there, just in their accounts, and then now they're starting to like just find ways to just loan it out, invest it out, get into private equity opportunities, invest in renewables as you're talking about, and they get really aggressive on it just because they have a lot of cash sitting in there just because government has like lowered interest rates and sort of like pumped a lot of their accounts.
And so isn't like how they sort of want to deploy that cash.
And I think that like if there's a lot of money, then they're just like much, much more aggressive with deploying that cash. And if the banks have less money, I guess they're less aggressive. I'm sort of like reading the book and I don't have an economic background, so I might be just saying a bunch of wrong things. I'm trying to understand it, hence I'm asking these questions. But yeah.
Yeah, I think, to answer that question, I think, I don't know, from like a sort of high level perspective, like, I think the level at which like the governments or even private institutions would sort of deploy cash would sort of come like tie back into like how confident they are in like the economy and whether the way they invest in that cash will result in getting like a good return on that investment. And usually that's sort of related to like sort of consumer sentiment and how much the economy is willing to sort of spend money, for example, call it consumer confidence. And so typically like that sort of comes in cycles. And if they were to have sort of be sitting in a lot of cash, like there's one thing to have a lot of cash to deploy, but there's another thing to sort of know that there's like the right assets to put that money behind. So I think something that we're currently seeing is that like a lot of funds, and I think coming out of the back of COVID, because no one was really deploying during COVID because obviously things are very uncertain and people were quite sort of conservative about, investing. But so now like a lot of funds have so much pent up capital because they weren't sort of spending it during COVID. So we saw this rush like coming out of the back of COVID, when interest rates were still low, that everyone was sort of spending money, being really aggressive, buying assets because interest rates were so low at the time and it was very cheap to borrow money. But now we sort of have this issue where that interest rates are really high now and now it's really expensive to borrow money. But a lot of firms still are sitting on all this money that they sort of accumulated throughout COVID, but there aren't like a lot of good quality assets in the market right now to sort of spend that money towards, or like the asset valuations are like really high. So they're not as sort of confident with moving forward and, investing because it's too expensive. Even though they do have a lot of cash, it's like that cash still needs to sort of go towards the right investments at the right price. And currently what we're seeing, there aren't as many sort of good opportunities as there previously was. So there's still a bit of like still been a bit of a stall in like how aggressive people are when it comes to sort of buying assets and investing money.
And I guess right now you have been focused on renewable companies when it comes to who to loan money to.
Yes, that's right.
Got it. And then usually when you guys do create these loans, how long are the terms?
That's a good question. And I think it depends on the type of company that you're lending to, as well as the structure that you're lending into. Typically, we lend at like a sort of 5-year horizon. But for example, when we're financing like a solar farm or like a long sort of project that's going to take years to build, we have like a 5-year loan knowing that it's probably going to extend like for like multiple years, but it will sort of get refinanced every 5 years.
And so let's say you, I don't know, loan out $50 million for some solar farm,
Yeah.
and it will initially be a 5-year term. Does that mean they have to pay off the $50 million plus interest in 5 years? Or how do they do it where just before the 5-year ends, they refinance and they buy more time? Because, and then I guess they can do interest only loans. Is that a thing?
Yeah, for sure. Most of the time, like for a corporate company, they could have like an interest only loan. But then for most sort of infrastructure type financings, it is sort of interest plus principal, which we call like amortization. And yeah, typically, like for example, with infrastructure, like the project will typically take like 10, 20 years to build. At that point of the 5-year mark, they would refinance the loan to continue sort of borrowing at that level. But for example, like for an acquisition financing for like a private equity firm, usually they only sort of hold that company for 5 years before they sell it off. And so in that case, usually it would sort of end at the 5-year mark and wouldn't really be refinanced. So it all sort of depends on like what the financing needs are for like the borrower. But in terms of how frequently and how often it needs to be refinanced, depends on how long they need the money for, essentially.
So with the solar farm, when it's risk plus principal, it's amortized. Is that how to pronounce it? Amortization?
Amortize.
Amortized, when it's amortized over 5 years. So does that mean, so by the 4.5 year mark, they've already paid back like $40 million out of the 50 million, and then they're going to refinance and borrow another 50 million? Is that what it looks like?
Yeah, so I would say typically with that, the amortization wouldn't be as aggressive in the sense that it wouldn't be the whole loan that would need to be amortized. For example, if it was a 100 mil loan over the course of 5 years, there wouldn't be like, unlike sort of like a typical like consumer loan, for example, you wouldn't be like 20 mil each year until at the end it's like basically zero principal outstanding. It would be like sort of like between an interest only and a principal plus interest loan, where they would partially repay that principal by the end of that 5 year. Because if it was like fully amortizing down to zero outstanding, that would mean that they would have less flexibility with like the cash that they have. They would have to pay a lot more debt every year versus maybe being able to keep some of that debt, like sort of hold back that in terms of their cash reserves and sort of reinvest that into the business to do other stuff, for example. So it depends on how sort of risky the borrower is. Usually the riskier the borrower, the more we would want them to amortize and get our money back, versus if we were more comfortable with the borrower being able to service the debt, then we could even go as far as providing like an interest only loan, because they're so big and they're likely to generate a lot of revenue to service the interest. And we know that they're not going to like go into like insolvency, not be able to pay the loan. So it all sort of depends on like the credit grade, the credit risk grade of the borrower.
So that means if the company borrowed 100 mil, so near the end of the 5 year mark, they might have paid back maybe, say, like $20 million in interest, $10 million off the principal. So they still owe like, I guess, $90 million left. At this mark, they have the option to either one, somehow find $90 million to just pay off the loan and then be debt free, or refinance and extend it further.
Yeah.
Wow. And then 5 years later, they're going to be hit with the same option.
Yeah.
And it just keeps stacking.
Mm.
When does it end? How do they get out of this?
Well, I think it usually ends when, like, after, like, say, 10, 20 years, especially once, like, let's say the project, the solar farm becomes operational and it starts generating revenue. After a while, they'll be able to accumulate enough revenue to pay off the loan. So there's, like, a certain metric we look at called, like, net debt to EBITDA, which means, like, EBITDA is just, like, earnings, like, the profit that the business operates, and the debt would be the amount of outstanding debt that they have. And so, like, let's say it was like a 4 times leverage multiple, it'd be like 4 times debt over earnings. So basically it takes 4 years of earnings to repay the outstanding debt. So we look at that metric quite closely. Not so much in infrastructure project finance, because that's like it's a really big number because it's over such a long period. But that gives us a good indication of how long it will take to sort of repay all of the debt within, like, based on the earnings of the business or earnings of like the project, for example. So at that point, when they do sort of pay back all the debt, like they would like have enough cash that they would have, generated over the years to repay it. But a lot of the time what happens is that these assets sort of get acquired by like another company, and then another company will sort of issue debt to then sort of kind of replace the debt in this business a lot of the time as well. So the debt just sort of keeps moving and changing like hands, essentially. Yeah, because it's good to have debt in the business because there's like tax benefits to it, and yeah, it helps sort of with like the capital structure of a business. Yeah, because like the more debt you have in a business, the higher, and this is getting a bit technical here, like the more you can get on a return on the investment or the equity that you put in. So that's another reason why it's people typically like to keep debt in the business, even if they can completely repay it, like with the cash in the business.
There was this example of like this company that made sort of steel bearings for like conveyor belts and airplanes, and it was like a very solid company. And I think a private equity firm bought it, grew it, sold it in 5 years. And then the next company did the same thing. And each time it got sold and bought, a bunch of debt was sort of created and they put it onto the company. And then I think eventually, like the last round, where I think they just couldn't get any more money from the bank, so they like started issuing bonds to like the public, or issuing bonds to like retirement funds, and somehow rolling up the debt. And I was like, this is so crazy. And it got to a point where the profit barely covered the interest. So they were like not paying off any of the principal of the debt, and they somehow could just keep doing this. And that really shocked me.
Yeah, so with those larger companies, like that's sort of the key metric they look at, which is like earnings to interest how much their earnings can cover like the interest obligations. And so it's sort of usually typically on like an interest only type of loan. But like I think the way to sort of get around that is that it'd be like a really big company that a lot of banks would want to bank. And so they'd be willing to sort of take a bit of a hit to like the structure of the way in which they borrow the debt, because they know that this business is going to perform really well, and they don't really have, there's not too much of a risk that that business is going to deteriorate performance and get to the point where it's unable to service their debt. That's typically what like an airplane company, for example, could probably pull off. Is that they have like multiple like types of debt within their capital structure, because everyone wants to bank like airplane companies, except for maybe during COVID.
Interesting. Is there any way, actually, I haven't ever done this before, but I have an American Express credit card. I always pay off the balance at the end of each month. Let's say I spent $10,000 on the Amex card. I can either pay off the $10,000 at the end of the month, or I could pay the small minimum amount of like $60, which is like tiny. And then I guess next month I could spend another 20 grand, another 10 grand, and now I have $20,000 on the credit card. And that month I might only have to pay like $120, the minimum amount. Obviously I think it will eventually cap out at like, I don't know, like 50, 80, $100,000, whatever my credit limit is. And I guess if I just keep paying the minimum amount, I'll have like 30 years to pay it off, or like, yeah, like that's that small amount, such a small percentage of the total debt. But I guess the downside would be I'll be paying like 22% in interest or something over the period of like 10 years. I don't know how long it would be. Is that sort of what would happen if I just paid the minimum amount only?
Yeah, well, that's how they get you. That's how they make money, right? Is like the interest. And the interest will keep accruing on that amount that isn't charged on the minimum amount on that part, basically, and you'll have to pay like 20% interest on that. So I guess the rule of thumb is to repay the entire sort of amount at the balance at that last statement. So then no interest will accrue moving forward. But yeah, like if you pay that minimum amount, yes, you can avoid paying off that other amount, but you'll accumulate so much more interest on that.
You know how like with that credit card example, it's so obvious that like you want to avoid paying the minimum amount, you want to try to pay off the whole amount, and that's how they get you.
Yeah.
But the examples we talked about earlier about these big companies, aren't they literally just doing just that, paying like the minimum amount and just like somehow refinancing and rolling up the loan and just like, or are they doing something different?
That's a really good question. Well, the thing is, I think the key difference is that on the credit card loan, your interest rate is 20%. So it doesn't really make sense to borrow at that level, right? But when there's a company that's borrowing money, it's usually like, depending on the structure, like anywhere between like 3 and 5% sort of in this economy, for example. So yeah, it is a lot like cheaper from an interest rate perspective, from a margin perspective, as a company. Like for example, if you're buying a house, right, like your margin, your loan probably around 6% at the moment, whereas a credit card is like 20%. So that's a lot more expensive per dollar versus if you were like owning a house or like as a company, because I guess the key difference is that, as I was mentioning earlier, the margin on interest rate, it reflects how risky the borrower is. Like one individual, like you're basically looking at one salary, and if that person sort of loses their job, essentially they're not able to repay anything. But for example, like a business or like a house, it's a lot less risky because the business obviously generates like revenue, and there's multiple sources of revenue for some businesses, and they're a lot more stable and generate a lot more money. So, the bank is a lot more confident that they're able to sort of get their money back because the business has a much sort of higher credit rating versus like an individual, for example. So that's sort of how it makes more sense to borrow as a corporate versus like as an individual. Also, there's like tax benefits that like a corporate would have that an individual wouldn't necessarily have if they borrowed more money.
In the
But
current,
because of like owning a house, there are also tax benefits of that as well.
makes sense. In the current economy, in Sydney especially, you're sort of going to be negative geared in all sort of property sort of investments. If you had an interest only loan, could you be positive in that scenario where the rent you can get is going to be higher than an interest-only mortgage?
You would be positively geared. Like, that's a good question. Like, you could be positively geared because you're not paying any principal. Actually, no, let me rephrase that. I think when they look at gear, like negative, the way they define negative and positive gearing is it doesn't actually take into account the principal that you pay for it. So when they say like a property is negatively geared, it means that like the revenue that that property generates, let's say you're like leasing it out to like someone that's renting the property, that amount of money that you make does not cover your interest, like your strata fees, your maintenance fees, your council water rates. It doesn't actually take into account like the principal, like the amount of money that you pay back to the bank to decrease the size of your loan. I'm pretty sure that's what negative gearing refers to. So if it was an interest only loan, like the interest would probably be a lot more than like a principal plus interest loan. So it'd be probably even more negatively geared. It's my understanding. I don't think that the principal that you pay back is considered in the negative gearing calculation, but I might be wrong. But I'm pretty sure from memory, because it's looking at sort of like an expenses perspective. Paying back your loan wouldn't really be considered an expense; it'd be considered a liability. If we're going to get more technical in that sense.
Okay, wow. So I guess we're in a very tough market, Sydney, because like that's crazy how like on an interest-only mortgage, the rent doesn't cover the interest plus I guess strata and other fees. So if someone wanted to actually pay off their loan and do interest plus principal, that would be just bleeding money. Yeah.
I think the flip side of that is like usually like, and this is really testing like my property fundamental knowledge. Usually like a negatively geared property would have very strong like capital gains prospects, because what that means is like the rent that they get is not enough to cover like the expenses, right? And usually if the rent is not enough, that means there's less like rental like demand for that type of property. And usually like so like a low yield sort of property would be more like further away from the city, for example. Like there's less of a demand to rent that property, but if there's less of a demand to rent that property in that area, there's usually more of a demand to buy those properties in that area. And so for that reason, that property, even though it's negatively geared, the capital gains prospects for that company would be higher, because instead of people wanting to rent that property, there's more demand to buy that property. And so there's more demand to buy that property, then the price of that property has better sort of appreciation sort of prospects, if that makes sense. And then on the flip side, like high yield properties, like close to the city, like apartments, for example, have high rental yield and usually wouldn't be negatively geared, but they have high rental yield because there's more demand to rent versus demand to buy. And so usually apartments, even though they're not negatively geared, they're positively geared, like their capital gains prospects aren't as high. So when, let's say, the seller comes to go sell the property, they won't be able to sell it for as high of a price because there's less demand to buy it, because there's more demand to rent it, if that makes sense.
And then I guess why, or is there like a public example of like a company that a bunch of banks were trying to compete to loan that company money? And I guess I thought people always need money. That I thought banks never needed to chase people to give money to. It sounds a bit counterintuitive. Or when would that happen, where the bank would chase or compete to give money away?
Well, it's usually just like the quality of, like, it's kind of a form of investment in a way, like loaning money, right? Because you're making a return a bit, like not as much as like if you were to put equity into business, but you're still making a return on the interest, right? And also like if you sort of loan them money for like example, like in like a big term loan, you can also like loan them, give like financial markets sort of ancillary services and make more money in that sense, right? And if it's a company that will like stand the test of time and will like is very stable and will grow like and perform quite well over the coming years, like that's a big opportunity for banks to make money by like lending to them in multiple ways, in more ways than one. And so that's an example of when like a bank would people would like banks would fight over like banking certain companies because everyone wants to bank this company and get a return.
Interesting. So I guess, like, for example, a company like Louis Vuitton, if they wanted to get like a $20 million loan to open up a new store in, say, Parramatta, they'll have a bunch of banks all over the world competing to give them this $20 million loan, and they can just pick the bank that would have the lowest interest rate.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. But that's if everyone wants to sort of there's competition, right? It's all about supply and demand in that context.
And then in Australia, you'd always have to have an interest rate above the RBA. Like, are there scenarios where you have loans that are 2, 3% below, and the RBA is 4%?
No, never.
Got it.
No, you would lose money at that point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. So I guess, how did you go from working in banking to then creating content, Linda? What
Yeah,
was it
I think
about?
yeah, that's a good question. I think like when you're working in finance and as we sort of briefly went over, like it definitely works a different part of your brain, I feel. It's quite complicated, very sort of analytical. And I think especially working at a bank, like the main sort of type of work you do is just like problem solving and analysis and looking at numbers and sort of structuring, finding the best solution for the customer. And I think especially when you work for like a big institution, there's a lot of sort of less room to sort of be creative and be a bit more entrepreneurial and have your sort of own sort of stamp on the work you do. It's sort of just like, I don't know, call it like being a bit of like a cog in a wheel, for example. And you have less sort of autonomy over exactly the type of work that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, you're really just providing like a service or a product to a customer within the realms of what the bank can and can't do. And I think for me, like that's all quite interesting, but I think part of me is also like has this sort of this itch to sort of build something of my own and be creative and have a bit of like a creative outlet in a sense where you feel like you can really sort of have your own work that's all you and have your own sort of baby in a sense. And I kind of felt like I needed some sort of outlet and something that was like mine that I could really pour myself into, especially that sort of creative sort of outlet. And I think that combined with obviously sort of going through my own journey in my 20s, moving out of home, going to corporate, there's like so much change that I feel like everyone sort of goes through. And it's hard. And like no one really prepares you or tells you like what to expect in your 20s, especially when you sort of start working full time, living on your own. And it can be quite sort of overwhelming for most people, I'd say. But I feel like, especially if you do work in corporate, it's not something that's really normalized, I feel. And people just sort of go through this journey, these challenges like in isolation and at least not really feeling like there's like a safe space to sort of talk about it. And I feel like the reality is that a lot of people actually experience this in isolation and they sort of, come experience the same sort of issues when it comes to like, the stresses of working full time and sort of, having to balance that with like your relationships and like being financially independent and all that's, moving overseas. Like there's so much that sort of goes on when you're in your 20s and it's quite challenging, I feel. And I think like I sort of went around circles, but I felt like I experienced that and I had a lot to sort of say about that experience. And I felt that a lot of people needed to hear like that experience because I knew and had this feeling that a lot of people were experiencing like going through the same sort of experience, but didn't feel comfortable enough to sort of openly talk about that because it wasn't really normalized in the workplace or online. And so it was sort of the combination of those two sort of things that sort of led me to sort of start creating content. It was like a creative outlet, but also like I felt like it was important for people to sort of see this type of content online. Just given my experience, like I would have loved to see this type of content if I was in like someone else's shoes going through this similar experience.
Do you see yourself sort of in corporate for the next 20 years?
I I think that's another good question. I think for me, there will always be a part of me that kind of wants to create something of my own. I think that's obviously it could be a lot more stressful, but I think it's definitely like very fulfilling, a lot more fulfilling. And I think at least sort of within that next 20 years, attempt to sort of do something like that. I feel like corporate is something I can always sort of go back to if I wanted to. At least at my age now. So like I think it's definitely worth a shot to try to sort of eventually be able to sort of work for yourself. I think that's a lot of people's goals as well in corporate that no one really talks about. But yeah, it would be like amazing to sort of be able to do that at some point. Yeah.
Did you always want to sort of work in corporate? Or what was the catalyst that got you, yeah,
Like working in corporate or like content
working
creating?
corporate? Yeah.
I think to be very like frank, I think it's quite a typical pathway that a lot of people go through. Going to high school and then going to uni, then getting a degree, and then using that degree to get a job. It's quite a well-trodden path. It's quite a like relatively risk-free path, right? Because there's like a steady sort of source of income that sort of comes through. You can sort of use that income to sort of support yourself. And so I think the sort of journey that a lot of people sort of go through, because it is sort of like the path that a lot of people sort of go along, and is I think relatively easy to sort of follow what sort of everyone else is doing. So I think, to be honest, like I think that's sort of the path I sort of took because it was, I guess, a bit more of like the easier option. And I think like I don't know, like this might be like a bit cheesy, but I think my like growing up during high school, like my dream was to actually be like an actor or an actress. And I guess you could sort of call it like a pipe dream. But I think one of the reasons I decided to say to not sort of pursue that anymore was I think the idea that I'd sort of really worked so hard throughout high school to sort of set myself up to sort of go to a good university and go into a good degree that would get me like a decent job that sort of meant that I was able to have like a certain standard of living. And I think part of me was like that's sort of the minimum that I would sort of want to aim for when it comes to thinking about the next 10 to 20 years. Whereas if you're going to commit to becoming like an actor and actress, like the reality is that you're going to have to accept potentially being, call it like a struggling artist for like 10 years before you actually make it for like the majority of people. So I think for me, like I wanted to set myself up at least well in like my younger years, have the skills sort of like, set myself up for a good standard of living and, learn like the important skill that you need to learn. I think working full time in corporate really teaches you a lot of really important skills. One being like communication, like working with, cooperating with people, teamwork, like analyzing, like I think it really sets you up for whatever you want to sort of pursue later on in your life. And so that's sort of, I guess, why I sort of went into like my current role. Because I think even if it's something I might not want to do for the rest of my life, I think at least for now, like in my early 20s, it will sort of position me well for whatever I sort of want to do later on. And I think it's a good way to sort of start off your career, especially if you aren't 100% sure of exactly what you want to do. It's sort of the best way to sort of set yourself up for when you do decide what you do want to do later, to sort of be well equipped for that when you do get there.
You do the whole like selective school, high school, and then like try get the highest A you can, go into like university. Was that the route you took, the sort of traditional Asian sort of Sydney route, or was yours a bit different?
I think that was the traditional Asian in Sydney like route I took. I went to a all selective school that was quite competitive academically. I think it's really true that like your environment and the people that you're surrounded by really shapes who you are. Especially when you're young and you haven't really built your own sort of.
Which high school was it?
I went to North City Girls, so I think yeah, like during my time, it was very sort of academic focused. And so I was quite focused academically, even to the point where like I saw everyone around me was like getting like tutoring for like HSC, and my parents were like pretty relaxed, and I was like, no, I want tutoring. Like, and so I think that probably did play a big part in influencing my trajectory, like going to uni and then also like go into my current role as well. I think it has its advantages and its disadvantages.
Did you grow up North Sydney? Whereabouts did you grow up in Sydney?
So I grew up in like inner west. So I lived in the inner west, but then I like went to North Sydney High School like during that time. Yeah,
What year did you graduate?
2015. Yeah, so it's been like almost 10 years since high school.
It's quite rare that your parents didn't put you in tutoring, especially being like inner west as well. That's like not common. Did you get Sydney girls just off raw talent then?
Well, I went into tutoring to get into North Sydney, but
Oh,
at the end of like high school, they went like, "Oh, you need a tutor for HSC,"
yeah.
and that was that point. I was like, "Yeah, I want tutoring for HSC."
Nice. And like another cool thing, like that's not really common, it's sort of like you moved out. Like, yeah, like a lot of people in Sydney, especially if you're Asian, like tiger parents and like doing the whole selector school route, usually you sort of stay at home till like your 30s or till you're married. What catalyzed you to move out? So,
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's like two parts to this. I think the first part is that I don't think my parents are like typical Asian parents when it comes to that approach around like staying at home until you're married. My dad actually like his view is that the sooner you sort of leave, the sooner you can sort of start becoming independent and learning those sort of essential life skills. And he was quite sort of firm on that belief and really sort of encouraged me to sort of move out as soon as I could. Like it was actually quite funny. I think during COVID, I started like working full time, and I think that was like at that point there was like some sort of government subsidy scheme where you could sort of get a certain amount of your expenses, like for example electricity back if you were working from home, you could sort of claim something back on that. He was like, you should start like taking advantage of that because like without electricity charges. So I actually started making me like pay for the electricity and gas bills because I could get like a return on that based on the policy at the time. And I think that was just sort of like the first sort of push to sort of get me to move out. And I think like that combined with like feeling like it was right time for me to sort of have that sort of flexibility and freedom away from my parents as well. And really do think that moving out forces you to become a lot more independent and do things by yourself. And I think it's just that mindset shift. It's like not only in the form of like, well, now I'm gonna have to cook myself and like make my own like bed and like wash my own clothes, but I think it's just like obviously my parents will always be there if I need their help, right? But it's just like having that flexibility of knowing that you really have control over everything that you do on the day to day and being more independent in that respect. And it kind of gives you a bit more time back as well, like, you know, moving closer to the city, especially if you work in the city, having less of a commute in that and like having that sort of lifestyle as well, like work, like living close to the city. And I think it all has that sort of set of advantages that you have. I guess the flip side is like you sort of have to start paying rent sooner and not be able to build your wealth as much. But I think like the return you get from the personal development of living by yourself, like at an early age, probably outweighs that.
sense. With your skill set, could you like easily get a more chiller corporate job that's pretty set, like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and have the exact same pay? Is that possible?
Um, it probably is. That's like a really good question because I think a lot of the time, like unless you work in like I think a good example is like take a step back, like the big four accounting firms. Like the grads that go into those firms get paid so much. Get paid like peanuts, but they work so much. They work so many hours. And it's like, why is that the case? I mean, I think a big part of that is because there's so much demand again from like a supply grad perspective. So many grads want to go into those firms as their first job because of like your reputation, right? And versus like, I don't know, you could work for like a government client or you could I think even like work in like the construction industry, for example, be like a carpenter or like a plumber and get paid way more on like entering in as like an entry level. And even like doctors don't get paid a lot. Like entry level doctors don't get paid a lot. And I think this sort of balance between upskilling, like in the short term, but not getting paid for it, versus those skills actually like being able to, you can monetize that skills way more in the long term, for example. So like I think for me now, like yeah, I could probably go to like a government and get paid the same amount and have way less hours, but the future sort of earning potential within that job is not as high as working in like a bank or like a corporate. One, because like I think the accession like within governments, for example, doesn't happen as frequently. And so you would need like lots of years of experience before you can actually start earning a lot. Whereas like in like banking, for example, like you progress quite quickly through the organization. And like let's say like by the time you're like 30, 35, you could be earning more than what you could be earning like working in government, for example. So like the trajectory and the upside is a lot higher than like another company or like working for government, for example. But like the starting point might be a bit lower.
You know how like
Yeah.
the like top four accounting firms, I might be wrong, but I guess is it Deloitte, like Ernst and Young?
Yeah. Deloitte, EY, KW, KPMG, and PwC.
Obviously, perfect. You get in as a grad, it's super competitive, you're working long hours, you're getting paid peanuts. By 35, if you continue doing a good job, where would you be at within that company and how much would you be getting paid?
I'd say by 35, like the really good performers could probably become a partner at that point. And that's when you like profit share with like, you know, what the business makes. I'd say you could probably get up, this is way above my pay grade, but like 400 to 500K per year. And I think like at like one of those big four accounting firms, you become a partner. But I think everything below that is not that lucrative. But most of the time, people don't really work in Big Four to stay in Big Four. They work in Big Four to get that experience and to get that, you know, skill set that is highly monetizable and then move to like another company, like in-house, for example, would pay a lot more. If you go to like a bank, you go to like, you know, like a corporate, like most of the time people start their careers in those companies to get that reputation on their resume, and then they would sort of use that to sort of go to a much higher paying job later.
Now, another thing I've been hearing a lot about, just because I never went through the whole corporate route, I'm sort of like on the outside, try and peer in and learn. But management consultants, apparently that's something that's like really hard to get into, long hours.
Yeah.
Apparently that's also competitive. Do you start with peanuts or do you start pretty well? And what is it looking at like when you're 35 doing that?
Yeah, I think again, like management consultants depends on what tier you're in. There's like the consulting at a big four, and then there's like strategy management consulting, like mid-tier consulting. And then you've got like your top MBB like consulting firms like McKinsey, Bain, BCG. Like
Yes.
I think mid-tier to top tier, like those do get paid quite well starting as grads. But everything other than that doesn't really get paid very well. And like
And then what is it starting at? And if you stay in like a Bain, what does it look like when you're 35?
yeah, I'm not probably the best person to answer this because I don't work in consulting, but I'd say it starts at around probably anywhere as a grad, like 130 to 180, maybe
Yeah.
130, 150. There might be some sort of sign on bonus as well, which I've heard. And by the time you're like 35, you'll probably become like a manager, senior manager at that point. And I would probably say, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers like 250 to 300K per annum.
Would be less than like someone that's like 35 in like a top four accounting firm.
Well, that's like if you. I think it would probably still be more. Um, I was saying like a partner. If you're like a partner, it'd be way higher at like. I would assume it'd be higher at like a boutique or like a smaller like mid tier, top tier management consulting firm, just because there's less headcount. There's less people to sort of share the profits with.
And then the last thing I hear is like IB, investment bankers, investment banking. Is there like a top four investment banking firm? What are those? Or like, yeah, tell me about, educate me on that.
So I think with investment banking, I think like my job is kind of similar to investment banking. Like the type of work we do is kind of similar because it is like providing financing for investing, but like the culture and the business model of commercial banks versus like investment bank is quite different. I'd say like the bulge bracket investment banks like would be like UBS, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America are probably the top ones. Might have missed one or two. They also pay very well, probably quite similar to management consulting and equally as competitive, I'd say. And I think the main reason why people want to go into those, at least grads want to go into those two types of roles, like both of them are very time intensive. Like I'd say like 60-hour work weeks are quite common, at least across both. I think at least with actually with both management consulting and investment banking, like the typical exit strategy for people who go into those two types of roles would be private equity. And that's when like if you go into private equity, like your pay, like as an associate or a VP, like you would get paid like quite well. But I think it's like once you start actually having equity in the business, like the managing directors of private equity firms get paid like millions per year because it's as much like as I was saying earlier, like say you buy like a company for like I don't know like 100 mil and you sell it for like you make 2 times your money like 200 mil within 5 years. That's like 100 mil that you make, and then if you take like 1% of that, that goes to the company. That's already 1 mil. So yeah, I would say like most of the time when people go into investment banking, they go into private equity after because the hours are tend to be a bit better, and there's a lot more upside when it comes to progressing within like one of those firms.
And then obviously people can work in JP Morgan and not be an investment banker, right? They can just be like a analyst or like some normal role.
Yeah, yeah.
Got it. Okay. And then I've met less investment bankers than management consultants. So based on that, I always just thought investment bankers are more rarer, it's more competitive, it's harder, it's more prestigious, or you get paid way more. But based on what you're saying, it's quite similar to management consultant team.
I think it depends on what you define as like management consulting. Like I think if you think like usually if you like want to go into private equity, they'd like say bulge bracket IB or MBB like management consulting, and MBB refers to like Boston Consulting Group, Bain, and McKinsey. Those are the ones that are really hard to get into, and those are the ones that get paid really well. So like maybe it's just like your circle, like more management consultants versus investment bankers. I feel like I know more investment bankers than management consultants. I guess given I work in like finance, but like yeah, like they're both very competitive to get into. I think I saw a stat that was like apparently it's harder to get into IB than it is to get into Harvard.
Whoa.
Um, yeah. So yeah, I think that's like the main appeal is that the reason why the exit opportunities are so good is because you're working double the amount that everyone else is working in a typical 9 to 5. So you're learning trajectories so much more, so much steeper, and you learn so much faster, and you learn how to operate so much quicker and better as well. So that's why like those people are highly sought after once they've done like a few years in those types of companies.
And then were those roles things you aspired to get into when you're sort of studying in university, or are you like you said you're pretty similar to investment bankers, or like yeah.
Yeah, I think like to be honest, like a lot of people again, it's that sort of herd mentality, right? Like investment banking is like the job that everyone in finance wants because it's the most competitive, it's the highest paying, and it really sets you up really well for success like later on in your career because as we talked about, like the hours you put in, highly prestigious. And I think it's like it's what's easily something that you could be attracted to when you're like quite young and you don't really know exactly what you want. I think I heard this analogy that was like investment banking is like, there's like this path that everyone sort of has to go down after uni. And investment banking is like you get given this really straight path and you get given the keys to like a Porsche to drive along that path. It's like very shiny, it's very prestigious. It's like, yeah, like all the things like that's easy to want as like maybe like a little bit of like like a lot of people, like a lot of young people, if they don't know what they want, it's easy to sort of want those things, right? I think myself included, like I like was going to like investment banking interviews, but I think like now that I've sort of done a few years in finance, I think I know that I don't think that work culture was probably for me anyway. Like it is like,
What degree do investment bankers hold? Well, what do they usually study in university?
yeah, probably like finance,
Oh, finance degree.
commerce,
Commerce.
finance, or like law and finance, like law and commerce with a finance major. But like I would say most people that go into investment banking have finance backgrounds, but like there are people like they are trying to expand like the pool into like having more STEM people with a more like diverse sort of background for that.
And then how do they pick employees? Like, what do they look for in interviews? Because commerce and finance degrees, that's like a dime in a dozen, right? Everyone, that's like a very common degree. There's not a huge barrier to entry. So how do they filter out who they want to hire? Is it just all off charisma?
I think the top thing is they first look at grades first. I think that's definitely one of like the thresholds that they look at is like academic performance, and they just want people that are really smart, basically having really good sort of problem solving abilities. Being able to think on the spot. I think same with management consulting. Like you don't necessarily need to have like a commerce degree. I think a lot of engineers can get into management consulting because it kind of has like the similar like logical thinking style that is required in consulting.
How do they test for that? Do they pre-screen with a test and you do that test?
Yeah, I think you have like your resume, obviously, then you have like personality, like tests, critical thinking tests, like that you need to pass in the beginning to get an interview. And then once you get to an interview, there's like a test around like a market sizing test, for example, and they'll be like, how would you go about guessing how many milk bottles get sold per year, for example? And then you have to walk through your thinking of how you sort of get to that answer. But it's quite different from, I think, an investment banking interview.
Have you trained and practiced for these interviews when you were looking for jobs? Is that something you drilled and trained for and practiced?
I don't think I did that enough, to be honest. I was really inexperienced when it came to interviews. Like, I didn't know what to expect. Like, yeah, I don't. Looking back, I don't think I was very well prepared for either like investment banking or like consulting interviews because they do require a lot of practice, especially the consulting ones, because you wouldn't really come across that stuff when you're in uni. Investment banking is a bit better because like you kind of talk about like transactions and like look at examples in like certain subjects in uni, which can be quite transferable. But the way you sort of present that and communicate that is something that needs to be sort of practiced, I think.
Can we run through like a role play where you can ask me a common question, I'll answer it, and then you can critique my answer and tell me what, like if it was a good answer, it was bad, what I could have improved on, if I would have passed the interview. Let's do a mini role play. If you have a question top of mind that is common.
Oh, this is really bringing me back to like those traumatic interview days. I think a question I remember quite distinctly was like, do you know what like a discounted cash flow model is?
No.
Um, okay, well that's a typical finance question. Do you have any accounting background?
I remember doing like one unit of accounting, like the very first year one. That's about it.
There is like an accounting question or like
Wow, so it's quite knowledge. It's not like a general like I remember Elon Musk would ask employees at like SpaceX like a question like if you started at the North Pole and you walked a kilometer east, a kilometer west, south, a kilometer west, kilometer north, where will you be? Like it would ask random questions. So it's not like that. It's like pretty technical questions.
oh yeah, for sure. There's definitely quite technical questions they have. Or they ask like because it's to sort of test like your like performance in the job, right? They'd ask like a market question, like what do you think about like a current trend that's going on in the economy right now and how it's going to impact like investment opportunities,
Whoa.
or
That's
like
a question. And then like would you have learned that in university?
you'd sort of like read up about it, like you'd read like the AFR a few times, like a bit before you attend these interviews, or like you listen to like at least I like listen to podcasts about like finance and the economy just to be aware of what was going on in the market. Because that's what you do need to sort of be aware of when you're working in finance is like deals that are going on and like how that impacts like the work that we do because it's quite sort of news dependent. Like I think yeah, they could ask you like what's a stock right now that you're looking at. They would ask you like do you invest, like are you interested in a stock at the moment, and like if you are like why, what's your investment thesis for that.
And with that question, you have the either option of like either being honest and saying no, I'm not investing in stocks, and but if you were, maybe just role play your thought process. Or I guess the other easier option that I guess people would lean towards is just to just like pull something from thin air and act as if they have a stock in mind and have a theory why they want to invest. They might say something like random like Tesla stock. Is that the intention behind these tough questions where it's like, or are these questions meant to be easily answered?
They're not meant to be. Well, if it was an easy interview, then everyone would do well in an interview, right? I think like the main thing they're trying to test with that sort of question is your commercial acumen. And obviously, like at least in investment banking, you're looking at, supporting. You have to sell like investments to like multiple institutions so that you can get their money to support like a transaction. And you need to like sell that narrative and understand like whether it's a good investment or a bad investment, for example, or it's a good deal to do if it's a bad deal. And like that kind of question around the stock and what stock you choose and why kind of tests that thinking of like why you think something is a good investment. So even if you like don't like invest, you can just say like, oh, I don't invest in this stock, but if I was to choose one, it'd be like, I don't know, like Woolworths, because I think it's a really sort of stable kind of business that has like an oligopoly in like the Australian market. It's been really stable over the past 10 years, and it doesn't look like it's got like a really strong position in the market at the moment. And there's always going to be consumers that need to buy milk, and it's going to ride like the cycle, interest rate cycle, like something like that. Like it just sort of tests the way you sort of think about investments and businesses, and it tests like how you think around that and the way you sell that as well.
That's cool. Linda, we usually wrap up these podcasts with two questions. One, any recent discoveries that you've implemented to your life?
That's a good question in terms of the context of this new year as well. I think this is a really like something that I noticed about like I'm always like thinking about the way I like work and how I can sort of be more efficient. And I think for me something I struggle quite a lot with is like time management and balancing my time between different sort of priorities. And I think something that I noticed about myself was that like a lot of the time I waste time making a decision. So for example, like let's say I come back from work and I have to like create content, but I also have to go to like also want to like, go to the gym and like be healthy. I would waste time deciding on whether I should create content or go to the gym because I haven't set these boundaries for what my time should be allocated towards when I come home from work, for example. I haven't planned it out. Which is called like decision fatigue. And something that I like want to do more of this year is being a lot more set with like my schedule and where I allocate my time and having like strong sort of barriers for that so that I sort of, get over that decision fatigue and save more time by just doing things. And I think that's one of the like, I haven't read the book, but I've heard it's one of the key concepts in Atomic Habits is getting like the whole benefit of having habits is that you just do something out of a habit without really thinking about it. And that saves a lot of time because you don't have to like make the decision to do the thing, you just do it. And that sort of helps you to sort of not only like take away that mental burden of making a decision to motivate yourself to do something, but it also takes like less time and puts more time back into your diary for doing things. And it's all about setting up these like small habits throughout your day that really helps to unload that mental sort of burden as well as like time in your day as well. Just being conscious of like when and how like making decisions actually takes time away from my day.
I like that. So I guess like sort of already have a pre-set routine on when you would create content and when you would go to the gym so that you don't have to think about it and just follow it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice. Last question. Any personal goals or focus for the next 6 months?
I think, yeah, I was thinking about this earlier this year. One of the goals I do have is probably to focus a bit more on content. And like, I think last year I was not as consistent with posting because I was not as disciplined with my schedule. And the way like work would like get really busy and disrupt my ability to sort of post consistently. And this sort of ties back into the first point I made about like creating a habit around the goals that I really want to work towards, which is like, maintaining a good sort of fitness regime and really spending more time on my content, being more consistent with it, and making that more sort of embedded within like my habits versus something I just do when I have the time. So that's probably one of my key focuses for the next 6 months.
Talking about content, any tips for growing? Like, how did you go about growing to like nearly 50,000 followers? Like, that's so impressive. Did you always have followers, or did it grow when you started this sort of journey of documenting?
Yeah, I think like, and to give you some context, I actually started on TikTok before I started on Instagram. I think a good like year before, and I like grew like a bit, but like not like significantly. And then I reposted all the videos I did well on TikTok onto Instagram and gained I think like 20,000 followers within like 2 months. Which just because I think one part of that is that like I think my audience is more catered towards Instagram because it's people working in corporate. And I've like asked my colleagues, none of them use TikTok because they think it wastes too much time.
Did you repurpose all the other videos, or did you only repost the videos that did well on TikTok onto Instagram, and you did that intentionally?
Yeah, yeah. So I only like mostly really used the ones that did really well. Yeah, and then so I think that gave me the confidence to sort of keep sort of creating like different types of content.
And now, do you post to Instagram first and then repost onto TikTok?
Yeah. I think my audience is just a lot more engaged on Instagram, so I think that's why I prioritize it a bit more.
Hmm.
I think it's just you have to keep sort of posting consistently until you sort of find a format or a type of video that just clicks with your audience. I think one of the biggest things that you need to think about as a content creator is how you give value to your audience. Like, why should they watch your video? Are they learning something from them? Are they, seeing a message that they relate to? Is it like eye candy? Like, is it like something that's interesting to look at? Like there's so many reasons why people would want to watch a video. And I think you need to really think about that psychology around why someone would want to watch your video or who you're trying to reach out to and who you think would benefit from watching your video. And constantly sort of once you sort of have that purpose, how you want to deliver that value or what value you want to deliver, you can just sort of keep experimenting with how you deliver that value. And then once you keep experimenting and find a combination of the delivery and what is delivered in a way like that appeals to your audience, like that's when you'll start growing and start getting more traction. So it's all about mastering like delivering value in a format that resonates or that works with your audience. And that takes a lot of trial and error, at least for me.
Do you have, now that you've found something that's worked, or maybe you had a video that go viral, are you just rinsing that format, rinsing and repeating that 3 second hook? Is it the exact same length each time, or do you still add in a bit of variation to your daily content?
I think it's a bit of both. Like once you find something that works, you should leverage that to grow. But at the same time, like, your audience will eventually get bored of seeing the same thing. I think that's like the practical element of like what you should do to like find a format that works. But I think like there's also a huge mental component. And I think that's probably the most important thing that I probably learned throughout my creator journey, especially in the beginning when you're like creating content and like it's getting like 100 only like a few views. Like I think mentally like you really need to be quite resilient, and I think it's really easy just to not make a video or to stop making content because you've created a video before and it didn't get any views and it's like embarrassing or cringe as you call it, right? Like
Do you think the videos, looking back, do you think it didn't go well because of bad luck? Or if looking at the content, you know exactly why it didn't perform and it wasn't a good video?
yeah, absolutely. I think, it's an art, right? And when you first start doing an art, you're going to be bad. Like, you're not going to know what's going to look good or what's going to, like, resonate. But it's all about learning that throughout the process. And I think for me, especially, like, because the content I was creating was, like, quite personal as well. And if you have, like, an ego, which I feel like most people do, like, it's like a cut to your ego if, like, you put so much effort into a video and it doesn't sort of perform well. you sort of take that quite personally and be like, oh, I'm like cringe, or like I'm not good at creating content. It's like really easy to sort of go down that rabbit hole, especially if you've like done it for like a while and like you're still not getting as much traction as you would have expected to, or as other people are sort of doing. You know, comparing to another creator is also like quite typical for a lot of people to sort of go through. But I think,
What's a healthier sort of
yeah,
one?
and I think this sort of aligns well to what like an entrepreneur's mindset needs to be when they first start a business. And I think that's like you have to have a really good reason or strong reason for creating the content. You can't just be like, oh, like I'm only going to create content because I want to have a big following and I want views and I want the attention and I want the brand deals. Or the same as like an entrepreneur, you want to be like, oh, I'm only going to like start a business because I want to make money. Because the reality is, especially like when you're first starting out, it's going to take you so much longer than you anticipated it to be at the beginning to get to that point or to reach that goal of where you're able to actually get that traction that you want. You know, like the money for like the business, or like, you know, the followers if you're a content creator, for example. And let's say it takes like an average of 6 months to sort of get there, or even a year, right? Like if you're creating content, you're not getting the views and you're not getting the followers and you're not getting the brand deals. Like if that's the only thing that's motivating you, you're not going to last long, because, you know, why would you keep putting all this time and effort into it when you're not getting and seeing those immediate results, or like getting that for a while, whilst also going through that mental sort of burden of feeling like you're cringe and being embarrassing and people watching you fail. Like people watching you fail and then you also not getting what you want like out of it is quite hard to deal with mentally, I feel, right? Like same as like an entrepreneur, if you were to start a business and it's failing or it's not making money and everyone's sort of seeing you like not getting anywhere, like, you know, it's easy to stop there if you're not getting the results that you want, right? And I think what's important is that to really ride out that wave, that initial period where you're not getting those results that you wanted, right? But still continue to put in the time and the effort into it. Like you need like a better reason. You need like a reason that will get you through that wave. And I think that's where the purpose sort of comes in. It's like what will make you like create content, like regardless of whether it gets you views or gets you followers or gets you that brand deal. Like you need to find value and motivation and reward in doing that in itself, because that's what's going to actually sustain you to keep creating content like for a long enough period where you can actually start potentially like getting results out of it, if that makes sense. So like for me, like even I have to tell myself like, okay, even if this video does well, does badly, and I put my like time and effort and heart and soul into it, and it like my purpose in creating this video was to sort of like convey this message that I had about working in your 20s, that I think I get value from, and I think someone else would get value from. If like one person gets value from that video, then that makes making that video worth it, and it makes me like feel like that wasn't a waste of time. And I think it's important to have that sort of purpose and that why, because like if your why was linked to getting the followers and getting the brand deals, like you're gonna sort of burn out quite quickly, because you're gonna find out pretty quickly that you're not gonna get that as soon as you would have liked, and you're gonna have to put in all this investment in the beginning before you really see that result, or if you see that result. So I think that's why it's one of the biggest lessons I learned like starting out as a creator is that you have to have a very like good reason for creating the content. Otherwise you won't really sort of like sustain, if that makes sense.
Great piece of advice, Linda. Linda, how can our audience get more of you?
Well, I think like right now I'm just mostly on Instagram and TikTok. So at quarter.lifediaries. Those are currently the only two platforms I'm on at the moment. Like maybe in the future I might sort of expand to like Facebook or YouTube, but I'm currently just focusing on those two for now.
Beautiful. We'll link the TikTok and Instagram in the description below. Thank you so much for your time today. This was a fun conversation. I just loved hearing your journey and sort of, you know, you talked about things being pipe dreams, but I think that was quite cool to talk about, like how like, hey, like I have these dreams, and you know, people may call it pipe dreams, but like these are things I want to do. And I think it's it's a very relatable story. And he did a really great job sort of being vulnerable and sort of sharing it, because I think a lot of people are probably in a similar boat, but you've done a great job vocalizing it, and it's definitely not easy doing so. So thank you so much for your time today, Linda.
Yeah, all good. Thanks so much for inviting me on this podcast. I think this is my first podcast I've ever done. Apologies for like the chaotic, like coughing, needing water, like teams was just coming in. But yeah, hopefully it was like a good conversation and you got a bit out of it too. And thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you so much for pushing through and still doing it despite being sick. So I really appreciate that. So thank you. But yeah, guys, hopefully you guys got some value. Please let me know your thoughts on the episode, and I'll see you guys next week on another episode. Peace.